Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. Over the course of this video, I'd like to walk you through the millennial history of Jews in Ukraine and try to describe how they interacted with the peoples of that region. Here you can see Ukraine, a nation of some 42 million people, about the size of France. It's an extremely valuable piece of global real estate because it has a very rich soil, a black soil that has a phenomenal agricultural output. It's often called the breadbasket of Europe. One of the things that we'll see about the peoples of Ukraine, because it is appropriate to speak of it as a multi-ethnic nation state with not just Ukrainians, but also Jews, Poles, Russians, of course, and many other nationalities living within this region, is that the region is largely fissured, a very long-standing, centuries-old fissure, part of which makes Ukraine face towards the east and the north, kind of oriented towards Moscow, and part of it which faces towards the west, toward Warsaw and also towards Paris, London, and New York. We'll see how this occurred over the course of this video, but it is important to note that Ukraine is a rather distinct territory, and although it did not receive formal statehood until the 20th century, it really has a very old history that goes back before most of the countries in this region, including Russia. In fact, it would be more appropriate to say that Russia belongs to Ukraine than to say that Ukraine belongs to Russia, as we shall see shortly. This map here describes an early medieval region called Kievan Rus. The word Rus is not related to the word Russia, but it refers to a series of principalities. It's hard to use the term state to describe these affiliated princedoms, fiefdoms, but they centered around the city of Kyiv. That's the Ukrainian pronunciation, by the way, that's favored today because, of course, Ukrainian is the dominant language in the country, but it used to be called in English Kiev, which is closer to the Russian pronunciation because Russia dominated much of this area in the modern era. But this period of Kievan Rus, which existed long before Moscow was even established, was focused around Ukraine and several of the Slavic peoples that emerged from Kievan Rus, which include not only the Ukrainians but also the Russians, the Poles, the Belarusians in particular. They all owe their cultural heritage to this region of Kievan Rus. What's especially important in its history is the conversion of one of its leaders, Volodymyr, pronounced in Russian Vladimir, shown here in a statue overlooking the Dnipro River that runs through the middle of Kyiv. Volodymyr made a decision to convert to Christianity. This is a period when Christianity was expanding in the region, and in the one of the most important early historical documents of the region, something called the Povest Vremeniach Let, or the Chronicle of Bygone Years, there is a discussion of how Volodymyr converted to Christianity, and he had a debate which would actually be familiar to students of Jewish history because the same kind of situation is enacted in the Kuzari by Yehuda Halevi. Specifically, Volodymyr in the 10th century invited representatives from all the major faiths active in the region, not only Muslims but also Jews, and two different types of Christians: Western Christians, meaning Catholics, and Eastern Christians, meaning the Orthodox. He has this long, drawn-out discussion about the various merits of each faith. He comes actually very close to adopting both Judaism and Islam, but he rejects Judaism because he is concerned about the fact that the Jews had lost their national homeland. He's concerned about the Muslims for a whole host of strange reasons that the authors of the Povest refer to, not the least of which is that they don't drink alcohol. And ultimately, he decides to adopt Eastern Christianity, that is Orthodox Christianity. And that becomes the faith of the majority of Ukrainians today. Although, as we shall see, a significant movement of Ukrainians in the western region adopt a form of Catholicism which retains certain important aspects of Orthodox practice, even while remaining allegiance to the Pope. Now, where did he get these Jews to debate with? In the Povest, they brought them from Khazaria. Khazaria is a fascinating chapter in Jewish history. We don't have a lot of time to explore right now, but it was, according to medieval sources, a medieval Jewish kingdom that existed between the Black and the Caspian Seas, as you can see here, for actually several hundred years. Now, there's a lot of questioning among Jewish historians about what is the extent of the conversion of these local peoples to Judaism. There are some scholars who believe that it's all a myth, that it was made up in the medieval ages. Other scholars retain that it was in fact a Jewish kingdom, but the Judaism was quite attenuated. Perhaps it wasn't rabbinic Judaism. Not for our discussion today. But it is interesting to note that there were definitely Khazarian Jews who were active in Kiev. One of the most fascinating documents to emerge from this period is this document, which was a letter called the Kievan Letter, discovered in the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza is a collection of medieval documents primarily written in Hebrew characters, sometimes in Judeo-Arabic, sometimes in the Hebrew language. And this was a document purportedly from Kiev itself that was a letter of introduction for a Khazarian Kievan alms collector, tzedakah collector. And this was what we would call in modern Jewish parlance a petek, a little document that he would use. And the document talks about how, he's a member in good standing of the community, he's fallen on hard times, would you please help him out with a donation? And especially interesting is that there are several signatures, as is typical even in the 21st century, signatures of various dignitaries attesting to the truth of this person's bona fides. And one of those signatures is written, as you can see here, in Turkic runes rather than in Hebrew, which would suggest that one of the officials, the Khazarian Jewish officials living in Kiev, was not sufficiently literate in Hebrew to be able to sign his own name, but nevertheless was a figure of some importance. So what we know is that there were Jews living in Kiev in the period of Kievan Rus. And by the way, there were Jews there much earlier. We believe that there were Jewish settlements and trading posts on the Black Sea, but very, very little data is available about them. But definitely by the time you get to the 8th, 9th, 10th century, there is a Jewish presence in Kiev. There is even, in fact, a member of the rabbinic school of Tosafot, which left a very extensive commentary in the Talmud, who is called Moses of Kiev. There's several other figures from this period that indicate that there were Jews living there even at the very beginning of Ukrainian history. Now, what happens to Kievan Rus is it is overrun by the Mongols, and so there's a period when Mongols take over the entire territory, and when the Mongols finally recede, then the region of Ukraine is eventually absorbed into a very large state, which is called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, formed largely by a dynastic union between Polish and Lithuanian royalty. And as you can see, it's quite a massive state. It includes what would be today, you can see that it has modern boundaries on it, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and extends through Belarus and much of Poland, and includes a big chunk of Ukraine, not quite reaching down to the Black Sea. And to this region, you have a massive influx of Jewish migration that extends from the 11th century onward, especially peaking around the 16th century. And the reason why Jews are especially moving to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is dominated by Ukraine in the southern regions, is because they are being driven out from the west by an increase in anti-Semitism. charges of the infamous blood libel, the host desecration stories, the persecution after the Black Death of 1347-48. These are driving Jews to the east. At the same time, there is an economic vacuum that is attracting them to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The reason for this is primarily because Jews become part of a complex economic system in which Polish landlords who hold large Ukrainian holdings called latifundia hire Jews essentially to be leaseholders, to be middlemen for them, collecting income in the form of various types of taxes on produce, poll taxes, taxes for crossing bridges, all kinds of things. This system, also known as tax farming or the arenda system, was definitely exploitative. The Polish landlords had very little incentive to minimize their rapacious demands on the Ukrainian population, and they simply would send the Jews in to make their collections. The Jewish community's income was largely based on the differential between what they could collect and what they had to transmit to the Polish landlords. And so that meant that the pressure on the Ukrainian peasantry simply increased every year as the Polish landlords would demand more income from their latifundia, their massive holdings. And so many Ukrainian peasants, particularly males, simply abandoned their ancestral farms and they retreated to these kind of quasi-military sort of cowboy-like encampments, primarily along the rapids of the Dnipro River. And in these sort of encampments, they would make their living by pirating and by freebooting. And ultimately, they organized themselves under one leader, a man named Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who organized them all and rose up against the Polish landlords and their leaseholders. And in 1648-49, there was a wave of violence that shook Ukraine to its very core. And although Jews had been living in this region relatively peacefully for about 500 years, this was a moment when the economic tensions associated with the arenda simply spilled over into violence and would have a grave impact on Jewish self-image and the image of their Ukrainian neighbors as well, and put into motion kind of like a cycle of Jewish-Ukrainian recrimination. But we should remember that there is a triangular conflict going on here, that Poles are definitely part of the overall picture. This 17th century eruption ended when Khmelnytsky made a very drastic decision. Here you can see a map that shows the Zaporizhian Sich, meaning the region of Ukraine that was controlled by Khmelnytsky at its greatest extent. The line that sort of runs around the outside of the lighter green is the boundaries of contemporary ethno-linguistic Ukraine. Khmelnytsky, after having fought with the Poles and essentially, establishing an independent state, decided to ally himself with the emerging Russians in Moscow. And this was a very, very important and serious decision, because this essentially shifted the Ukrainian center of gravity from Warsaw and Poland to Moscow. Now, it's important to note, just looking at this map, you can see that he's not speaking for all Ukrainians. To the west, to the left-hand side of this map, just above the red smear that represents the Carpathian Mountains, you have the region known as Halichina, and above that Volyn, which were still in the Polish orbit. This is the region where a lot of Ukrainians adopted Catholicism. The Ukrainian language that they spoke was more heavily inflected by Policisms, and they generally looked to the West. This is a fissure that will repeat itself all the way up until the 20th century, because there are certain parts of Ukraine that always look towards Moscow and the East. Other parts always look towards Europe and the West. And it's the same kind of tension that's playing out today in our contemporary hostilities. The Jewish community of Ukraine is able to recover from the Khmelnytsky massacres, although they are commemorated in the liturgy to this very day. And there will be another major upheaval in the 18th century, the uprising under a similar leader called Honta. But what's going on internally in the Jewish community is that the Ukrainian Jews are being heavily invested in a spiritual phenomenon known as Hasidism. And southern Ukraine is deeply associated with the development of this movement, first associated with someone called the Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, who lived in southwest Ukraine, or if you prefer, southeastern Poland, in the 18th century. This map here from the Historical Atlas of Hasidism shows the dramatic explosion of Hasidic activity in Ukraine, particularly towards the western region, and it's spread throughout the entire area. To just give you a little bit of an orientation here, just to the right of the light yellow color, you can see there is Kiev, just in the gray side. So this is towards what's called the right bank Ukraine, by the way, because Ukraine is largely bisected by the Dnipro River and it flows south. So the right bank, meaning when you're standing beside the river looking to it where it flows into the Black Sea, that the right bank is where most Jews live. On the other side, the left bank, is a much smaller Jewish population, but nevertheless significant in the 20th century. So Hasidism grows apace during this time. It's also important to note that the Jews have organized themselves very well within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They've established something called the Council of Lands, which is essentially an interconnected network of Jewish municipalities called kehilot, in which they establish standard legislation for all Jews living within this massive country. It eventually would come apart in the 18th century for a whole bunch of reasons, but nevertheless, Jews are enjoying, even despite the terrible upheavals of the Khmelnytsky era, they are enjoying a tremendous renaissance and a period of great strength of their communal and spiritual activity. This comes to a dramatic conclusion with the partitions of Poland. In a very cynical political move orchestrated by the three neighbors of Poland, that is the German, the Austrian, and the Russian empires, they simply divide up Poland between the three of them in a series of three partitions. And in this map, you can see that the eastern section, sort of the orangish colors, go to Russia, and at the very bottom you see that darker green, the eastern part of the darker green area, known in English as Galicia or Halychina in Ukrainian, goes to Austria. Another example of the fissure between the eastern orientation of many Ukrainians that is going to be politically augmented by this new population of formerly Polish Ukrainians, now Ukrainians of the Russian Empire, and in the West, the formerly Polish Ukrainians who are now part of the Austrian Empire. That would pertain right up until World War I, and as we shall see. The Jews who find themselves in the Russian Empire are relegated to this large territory called the Pale of Settlement, which was the region where Jews were allowed to live in the Russian Empire. As you can see, just about the bottom half of this map is Ukraine. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire, in particular under Tsars like this man, Nicholas I, engaged in a very concerted effort to try and assimilate their local populations. In the case of the Jews, Nicholas I imposed the horrific Cantonist decree, which demanded that young Jewish males meet the quota to spend up to 36 years in military service. An absolutely horrific decree that caused untold tragedy in the Jewish street. In terms of Ukrainians, a little bit different, because Ukrainians and Russians were, as I alluded to earlier, related peoples. They were all Orthodox at this point. They had a similar language. Ukrainian is it's hard to define exactly what a dialect means, but it would be as easy to say that Russian is a dialect of Ukrainian and vice versa. But basically, they're written with a very similar Cyrillic alphabet, not identical, but very similar grammar, very similar vocabulary, but not identical at all. Generally speaking, Ukrainians and Russians can speak to each other and understand most of what they're saying in their respective languages, and they can also read each other's texts, but it's something like, German speakers and Yiddish speakers, or maybe a little bit further apart, Spanish and Italian speakers. Actually, maybe it would be someone like with a very strong Quebecois accent speaking to someone from Paris. That's maybe a little bit closer than Russian-Ukrainian. But in this environment, the Russian Empire embarks on a sometimes very coercive, sometimes very suggestive campaign to try to get the Ukrainians to think of themselves as the little brothers of the Russians. In fact, one of the terms that was used for Ukrainians at this time were Little Russians. And the Russian people were called Great Russians or Big Russians, trying to convey the idea that they were part of one family, that the Ukrainians were sort of the little brothers of the senior brothers, the Russians. In some cases, this meant closing down Ukrainian language schools that were developing towards the end of the 19th century, censoring Ukrainian language publications, and many other crude moves to try and make the Ukrainians think of themselves as being Russians. But it should be borne in mind that this is a period when Ukrainians were just beginning to articulate their differences, which obviously went back for centuries, but had not really been defined as such. This is an era in the late 19th century when all the peoples of Eastern Europe, including the Jews, are beginning to explore the idea of their self-determination and their national status. In the case of Jews, it is expressed in terms of experimentation with the Yiddish language and the development of Yiddish literature, the standardization of Yiddish, which had been spoken like Ukrainian for about 10 centuries, and yet it had never really decided on its own spelling, let alone its grammar. And also for Jews in the development of political Zionism, the idea that Jews constituted a distinct nation and should return to their national homeland. For Ukrainians, of course, they were indigenous, they were living in the national homeland, but it meant developing a national identity which was very sharply differentiated from their northern neighbors. This comes to a head in the revolutionary era immediately following World War I. This map here, circa 1900, shows the density of Jewish population in Ukrainian regions. The blue line represents Ukrainian boundaries as they exist today. And as you can see, the Jewish population is concentrated on the western side of the Dnipro River. That's the right bank region. But a significant amount of it spills over into the neighboring region of Austria and of Romania and even Hungary. This is, of course, a very heavily Hasidic region in particular. And these cultural boundaries, these linguistic and religious boundaries, are often much more significant than the political ones, as we shall see. So during the revolutionary era, leading up to World War I, and then especially in 1917, when the Russian Empire collapses, a lot of Ukrainians begin to say, hey, now is our opportunity to actually establish some kind of independence from the Russian Empire. At first, it's envisioned in the form of a federated Russian state that includes many of the non-Russian nationalities, like Ukrainians, like Poles, and so on. And one of the great champions for this kind of moderate evolution of greater Ukrainian national expression is this man, the historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. Hrushevsky and many others assembled an organization in Kiev called the Central Rada, or Central Council, which included Jews as well, with the idea of hammering out a rapprochement between the many peoples that live in Ukraine, not only the Ukrainian majority, but also the significant national minorities, including the Jews, the Poles, the Germans, the Russians, of course, all of whom had different ideas about how to shape the post-World War I reality. Unfortunately, the years after World War I were consumed by violence as civil war erupted, with many internal and external forces active in Ukrainian territory. There was an attempt, specifically by the inheritor of the Central Rada, the Directory, to establish that connection with the Jewish minority. This directory was led by this man, Simon Petliura. Unfortunately, Ukraine was submerged in communal violence at this time, and in particular, there were a series of pogroms concentrated in the year 1919, and one of the great paradoxes of this period is that 40% of the recorded pogroms were actually committed by the troops that ostensibly were loyal to the Ukrainian Petliura, who had a Minister of Jewish Affairs in his government at the time. It's a very confusing period. I've written about this if you're curious. Ultimately, the Soviets were able to seize control over most of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory, and they established a new country, the Ukrainian SSR, or Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Here on this map, you can see the boundaries of that new country. The white line that you can faintly see running around the outside represents contemporary Ukrainian boundaries, but more significantly is the pink area in the center, which is the boundaries of the Ukrainian SSR. The blue area just to the west represents those Ukrainians who found themselves not within the Soviet orbit, but within independent interwar Poland. And once again, you see that fissure where a large bulk of Ukrainians now find themselves associated, whether they like it or not, with Moscow and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and a minority in Western Ukraine find themselves associated, again, whether they like it or not, with the independent Poland that reemerges after World War I. Also interesting in this note is that it's not just Ukrainians. The little sort of yellow circles that have the number 3 on them all represent significant Jewish populations. And you can see, as we saw in earlier maps, there's a high density of Jewish settlement, particularly in right bank Ukraine, and especially in the Ukrainian region of Halichina, which at this point is in Polish control. There's a lot to say about the nature of Soviet rule in Ukraine. And I've spoken about it in other videos, so I don't want to go into great detail, but perhaps most significant for our purposes is the infamous Holodomor, a artificial terror famine orchestrated by Stalin that killed millions of Ukrainians in 1932 to 1933. The resentment against the Russian communists ran very high, particularly towards the western regions, and this accelerated a level of anti-Semitism that was specifically attached to the notion, false as it was, that the Jews were somehow behind communism and behind the Holodomor by extension. Obviously, much more to say about this complex period. Please have a look at some of my other videos to understand it. But what ends up happening in World War II is that the region is temporarily divided between Hitler and Stalin by a pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. Stalin and Hitler agreed to cynically divide the region that separated their two countries, the Third Reich on the one hand and the USSR on the other, very much like the cynical division of Poland 2 centuries earlier. And so part of the region of Western Ukraine found itself suddenly under the control of the Soviets for 2 years. During these 2 years, the Soviets subjected Western Ukraine to a very brutal, rapid process of communization, the collectivization of farms, the seizure of intellectuals, of intelligentsia of various types, priests and teachers and postal clerks and you name it, torturing them and ultimately murdering them. But what happens in Operation Barbarossa, which is June 22nd, 1941, is that Hitler double-crosses Stalin and invades the Soviet Union, catching him off guard, and as you can see in this map, penetrating deep into the Russian SSR and taking over almost all of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory. The Ukrainian SSR is almost completely taken over by the Nazis, and what's most significant for our purposes is that Hitler sends out 4 mobile killing squads into the region. The lowest one, as you can see, the blue lines there, is Einsatzgruppen A, which proceeds to go through the tiny little shtetls that dot the countryside, rounding up Jews, communists, political figures, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, anyone who is regarded as an enemy by the Third Reich, taking them out to the fields and ravines in the region and simply mass murdering them. This is incidentally the way in which most of my ancestors were killed, but not in Ukraine, but in Lithuania by another group of Einsatzgruppen. So the Nazis hold on to the Ukrainian SSR until the war begins to turn with the Battle of Stalingrad, and eventually the Russian Red Army is able to drive them all the way back to Germany and ultimately to defeat. The reconstituted boundaries of Soviet Ukraine after World War II now include those Ukrainians who were on the western side. They are dominated by the city of Lviv, or Lviv, as it would be pronounced by people in Lichna. These western Ukrainians are much less likely to support their incorporation into the Soviet Union, primarily because they've had more of an orientation to capitalism and to the West and to Europe in general. Nevertheless, these are the boundaries of the Ukrainian SSR that pertain right up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Under Gorbachev, when there were widespread protests, particularly by the non-Russian nationalities, and they're breaking away from the Soviet Union, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and so on, even Belarus, which is normally very closely allied with Russia, all break away and form their own states. And it is during this period, particularly from the 1960s onward, that you begin to see Jews and Ukrainians forming another kind of rapprochement, this time united in their opposition to Stalinism and to Soviet communism in general. One of the most notable figures that emerges from Ukraine at this time is the dissident Anatoly Sharansky, Natan Sharansky, who is now a very important leader in Israel, who was one of the prominent refuseniks, that is, Jews who were sent to prison for the temerity to ask for permission to leave the Soviet Union. And in many ways, Jews and Ukrainians exiled and imprisoned began to reform connections that would later be expressed in political activity and would ultimately result in the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991. Here's a map of what things are like today. As you can see, this map from the Washington Post gives you a sense of the linguistic differences of Ukrainians today. There's no question that the further east you go, the more Russified the population is, at least linguistically. The regions of Donetsk and Luhansk have a certain amount of dissident movements that Putin is taking advantage of, perhaps exaggerating and certainly leveraging for his own purposes. And it is in this region where Mr. Putin has currently invaded. The Crimea to the south has been seized by Russia for some time now, and it is in these regions where the hostilities are specifically focused. However, it's very clear from maps of troop buildup that they have troops in Belarus and in Crimea as well, which threaten Ukraine and could suggest the outbreak of much wider hostilities. How do Jews feel about this right now? Well, it's an unusual moment. Perhaps most ironically, the current president of Ukraine is in fact Jewish himself, and he has not made a secret of this, and he is the one leading Ukraine in their attempt to resist this Russian aggression. Many Jews, alongside their Ukrainian neighbors, are very concerned about the future of their country. Jews have the option, which is something that is very rare in Jewish history, but is a product of the 20th century, and specifically the late 20th century. They have the possibility of making aliyah, of leaving Ukraine and moving to Israel. This is something that changes the entire dynamic for many of the some 40,000 odd people who identify as Jewish in Ukraine today. But those Jews who are remaining, according to prominent leaders of the Ukrainian Jewish community, they will stay and they will fight and they will resist Russian aggression in their region. Let us hope for peace in the region and a long-standing resolution to this conflict that is in the best interest of all the peoples of the area. Thank you very much for watching.